happens when a single night turns an entire peninsula dark. At 2:47 a.m., the skies above Feodosia erupted not from thunder, but from the roar of engines no one could see. 251 kamikaze drones launched in coordinated waves streaked through the night, evading radar and anti-air defenses that once guarded Crimea like an iron wall. Their target, the Feodosia oil refinery, the peninsula's final operational fuel artery responsible for sustaining both the Russian Black Sea Fleet and civilian infrastructure. Within minutes, the heart of Crimea's energy network was gone. The attack was not random, nor was it impulsive. Ukrainian defense sources confirmed to Reuters that it was part of a new multi-layered offensive combining AI-assisted targeting and satellite-based pathfinding technology refined through months of NATO-supported intelligence sharing. American analysts from Defense News described the strike as a textbook case of modern asymmetric warfare, one that cost Ukraine only a fraction of Russia's mounting losses. As flames engulfed the refinery, sensors aboard Western satellites detected thermal spikes exceeding industrial thresholds, proving that tens of thousands of tons of refined fuel were lost. According to BBC's field reports, the explosion was visible from across the Black Sea, and seismic sensors in Georgia recorded the detonation's pressure wave. Fireballs rose hundreds of meters high, illuminating the coastline like a second sunrise. For many Crimeans, the sound of those blasts marked not just the end of sleep, but the end of normal life. Within hours, roads jammed with panicked residents rushing toward gas stations that no longer had any gas. Experts at DW noted that the Feodosia strike revealed the weakest link in Russia's logistical architecture, its dependence on centralized fuel hubs. Each destroyed refinery compounds a ripple effect from grounded aircraft to paralyzed civilian transport. Western defense researchers estimate that the cumulative cost of Ukraine's refinery strikes has already surpassed $2.6 billion in economic damage, while pushing Russia's southern military logistics to a breaking point. Yet behind this operation lies a deeper, calculated message. Under the Trump administration, U.S. military aid to Ukraine has shifted focus from direct funding to intelligence collaboration, empowering Kyiv to conduct high-precision, low-cost strikes using indigenous drone technology. A senior NATO official told The Guardian that this hybrid assistance model lets Ukraine hit smarter, not harder, undermining Russia's energy infrastructure with minimal collateral risk. As the smoke billowed for hours, Russia's emergency crews found themselves powerless. Satellite imagery released by Maxar Technologies the next morning showed the refinery reduced to a crater field. The fire was so intense that even firefighting aircraft avoided the area, fearing secondary detonations. Witnesses described the air as sticky with burning oil, and reports surfaced that black rain had fallen across nearby coastal towns. By dawn, the once bustling port of Feodosia was silent. No ships moved, no trucks rolled, no tankers left the yard. Crimea, long touted by the Kremlin as an untouchable fortress, was suddenly isolated, not by blockade, but by fire. Could this be the moment Ukraine finally turned Russia's pride into its Achilles heel? The full story, however, stretches far beyond that night. This attack was merely the final strike in a campaign months in the making, a campaign designed not only to burn fuel, but to choke an entire region's lifelines. Long before Feodosia burned, Ukraine had already laid the groundwork for this collapse. The peninsula's energy crisis was not born overnight. It was engineered step by step through what Western analysts now call the Crimean fuel trap. This strategy, confirmed by multiple Reuters defense correspondents, involved cutting every artery that fed fuel power and logistics into Crimea, forcing Russia to fight on a slowly tightening noose. It began with targeted drone strikes on mainland refineries that supplied Crimea. In early August, Ukrainian long-range drones hit the Tuapse refinery in Krasnodar, igniting storage tanks visible from space. NASA firm's satellite data confirmed days of uncontrolled fires, a clear sign that production had been crippled. According to Defense News, those attacks reduced output by nearly 40%, starving Crimea's supply chain before the Feodosia strike ever happened. The goal wasn't just to destroy, it was to isolate. Ukraine's planners understood something fundamental: modern war runs on logistics, not slogans. Without fuel, tanks become monuments, aircraft become metal sculptures, and soldiers become stranded. By early September, every supply route surrounding Crimea was being monitored by Ukrainian reconnaissance drones linked to NATO surveillance grids. BBC reported that British intelligence units based in Poland had provided satellite pattern analysis, helping Kyiv identify vulnerabilities in Russia's fuel distribution system. This coordination marked a quiet but decisive shift, one that turned Ukraine's drone campaign from sporadic strikes into a synchronized siege. Western observers describe it as a digital blockade. Instead of sending fleets or armies, Ukraine used algorithms, geospatial imaging, and precision timing to choke Crimea's lifelines invisibly. Analysts from the Atlantic Council compared the operation to a slow-motion embargo executed through the sky. Even Russia's own Ministry of Energy was forced to acknowledge in an unintentional admission reported by DW that fuel deliveries to southern military districts had fallen by over 30% due to ongoing logistical disruptions. As this invisible siege tightened, Moscow tried to compensate by rerouting supplies from deeper inside Russia. But every kilometer added meant higher risk, longer delays, and more exposure to Ukrainian sabotage. Al Jazeera reported that partisan groups in Melitopol and Tokmak coordinated small-scale strikes against supply trains and truck convoys, cutting off secondary pipelines that once served Crimea. The peninsula, once a symbol of Russian dominance, was being suffocated economically before the first drone even reached Feodosia. Strategically, Ukraine's approach mirrors the kind of layered attrition campaign once theorized by NATO planners during the Cold War, a doctrine aimed at denying mobility rather than inflicting mass destruction. As one retired U.S. Air Force colonel told Military Watch magazine, "This is precision warfare 2.0. You don't bomb cities, you bomb systems." Ukraine's modern drones, many of them domestically built with AI navigation modules, are proving that in the 21st century, the ability to disrupt infrastructure can be deadlier than any missile. Yet for all the strategic brilliance, this tightening grip came at a cost. Each strike risked escalation, direct or indirect, with Russia warning through state media that further attacks could provoke retaliation beyond Ukraine's borders. But even in the face of such threats, Kyiv persisted, confident that the moral and technological backing of NATO nations would keep the Kremlin restrained. By late September, the circle was complete. On satellite maps analyzed by DW, every major external fuel source around Crimea was marked in red, each refinery or depot either disabled or under repair. Only one green dot remained: Feodosia. When that dot vanished in flames on October 6th, Crimea became a fortress without a supply line, a garrison on the verge of collapse. And yet the story didn't end with drones or satellites. It was about to move onto the ground, where ordinary people would feel the full weight of this invisible war. At sunrise, as the smoke over Feodosia drifted eastward, Russia confronted an inescapable truth. Crimea was now cut off from the mainland. Not by decree, not by blockade fleets, but by physics and precision. The peninsula's three logistical arteries, the Kerch Bridge, the Black Sea ferry routes, and the southern rail lines, had each been targeted or rendered unusable in Ukraine's calculated campaign. This was no coincidence. It was the execution of what NATO analysts describe as multi-domain attrition designed to strangle Crimea's energy flow until every military convoy and civilian vehicle ran dry. The most symbolic blow was to the Kerch Bridge, Vladimir Putin's prized $3.6 billion project, once hailed as an unbreakable link between Russia and Crimea. But by mid-September, satellite images from Maxar Technologies revealed severe structural damage along several spans, where earlier precision strikes had weakened supports beyond repair. BBC engineers noted that even minor stress on those sections could trigger a cascading collapse. Russian inspectors quietly admitted the bridge was no longer safe for heavy tanker crossings. Each attempt to move fuel across risked turning the structure into a steel tomb over the strait. Meanwhile, the Black Sea route, once the Kremlin's maritime lifeline, had become a killing field. Ukraine's sea drones, guided by NATO's AWACS surveillance aircraft and Western satellite feeds, made the passage treacherous. Al Jazeera reported that in late September, insurance rates for civilian ships entering Crimean ports skyrocketed to over 900% above global averages. Dozens of Russian fuel carriers either turned back or idled indefinitely off the coast of Novorossiysk, refusing to sail without guarantees. One ship owner told Reuters, "It's like driving a tanker truck through a minefield, only the mines are underwater and moving." Even Russia's military fleet fared no better. After successive Ukrainian attacks crippled the Rostov-na-Donu submarine and several landing ships, the once feared Black Sea Fleet rarely ventured beyond its own ports. The maritime path to resupply Crimea had effectively vanished, replaced by silence and smoke. That left the railways, but they too had become war zones. Partisan sabotage intensified throughout the Zaporizhzhia and Kherson corridors. DW and The Guardian documented multiple derailments and bridge explosions, each one cutting vital resupply lines for days. Railway crews began traveling in armored cars, laying new track under constant drone surveillance. Yet no matter how much Russia repaired, Ukraine struck again, cyber attacks on rail signal networks. Small unit ambushes and drone-dropped explosives kept the arteries clogged. The economic cost of this logistical blackout was staggering. Analysts at Bloomberg Economics estimated that Crimea's isolation was draining Russia's southern GDP by nearly $500 million per week in lost trade and transport delays. Fuel shortages extended to military production lines in Rostov and Taganrog, where assembly plants slowed due to lack of diesel. In effect, Ukraine's strikes had severed not just Crimea's lifeline, but part of Russia's industrial heart. NATO observers describe this phase as logistical encirclement by design. A senior Pentagon strategist speaking to Defense News said, "This isn't just about drones. It's about turning Russia's geography against itself." Crimea depends on distance. Ukraine weaponized that dependence. Under the Trump administration, Washington's new military posture emphasizes strategic containment over escalation, giving Kyiv more autonomy to apply sustained pressure without triggering full-scale confrontation. As Crimea's ports sat idle and its bridges trembled, the sound of war changed no longer. The thunder of artillery, but the silence of engines without fuel. Truck convoys stopped mid-road. Ferries rusted in harbors. On the surface, the peninsula looked calm, but beneath that stillness grew panic. And soon, that panic would spill into every street, every home, and every hospital. The battle for Crimea was no longer being fought with drones or missiles. It was moving into people's lives. By the second morning after the Feodosia blast, Crimea resembled a modern ghost province. Lines of cars stretched for miles outside shuttered gas stations, their engines off, drivers sleeping inside to save the last drops of fuel. The hum of daily life buses, delivery trucks, fishing boats had vanished. In Sevastopol, Simferopol, and Yalta, silence replaced the traffic's pulse. "The war has reached our tanks," one resident told BBC News, clutching an empty jerry can. With fuel reserves depleted, the peninsula's civilian systems began to collapse. Reuters confirmed that more than 60% of gas stations in Crimea reported total stockouts by October 8th. Prices for the remaining liters spiked to 80 rubles, while on the black market, they reached the equivalent of $10 per liter, a level unseen even during the Soviet collapse. Many families resorted to siphoning gasoline at night from abandoned vehicles. DW reported that police patrols often ignored the thefts. Even local authorities were running out of fuel for patrol cars. Public transportation ground to a halt. Without diesel, buses and taxis disappeared from city streets, leaving workers to walk miles. Schools shortened hours to conserve generator power. Hospitals, according to Al Jazeera, faced a more tragic reality. Backup generators running intensive care units were running out of diesel. Doctors in Feodosia and Simferopol warned that they could lose patients simply because there's nothing left to run the machines. Crimea's puppet administration tried to impose Soviet-style ration cards, limiting each citizen to 20 liters per week. But logistics broke down before the program began. The same lack of fuel that starved civilians also crippled distribution trucks. Local officials appeared on state television urging calm, yet even their broadcasts were interrupted by blackouts. "We are living hour to hour," said one municipal worker interviewed anonymously by The Guardian. Western economic experts likened the situation to a de facto siege. Analysts from the London School of Economics noted that fuel scarcity in Crimea had triggered a secondary crisis: food supply disruption. Agricultural vehicles had stopped, harvests rotted in fields, and bakeries closed due to lack of energy. By mid-October, satellite night imagery showed vast portions of Crimea in near-total darkness. Psychologically, the population was unraveling. Telegram channels flooded with videos of fights at fuel stations, of people queuing through the night for a rumor of an arriving tanker. Many of those tankers never came. "It's as if the world forgot we exist," one elderly man told BBC reporters in Sevastopol. Across social media, even pro-Russian voices began questioning Moscow's ability to protect its most prized territory. Underneath the social chaos lay the deeper truth: the collapse of faith in Russian control. Reuters noted that morale among occupation officials had plummeted, with dozens reportedly sending their families to mainland Russia. The Kremlin's propaganda narrative of a stable, prosperous Crimea was burning out faster than the oil that fueled it. Meanwhile, Western analysts observed that NATO's indirect strategy was succeeding without a single foreign soldier on Crimean soil. The U.S. Department of Defense, in a briefing covered by Defense News, called the campaign an elegant example of non-contact warfare, proving that energy deprivation could be a weapon as effective as artillery. "It's not about killing people," one Pentagon advisor said. "It's about collapsing the systems that keep them moving." As day turned to night and the peninsula dimmed once more, questions began to echo among its weary residents. How long can life continue when the fuel that powers hospitals, bakeries, and even hope itself is gone? While civilians lined up for drops of gasoline, the Russian army in Crimea faced a more fatal shortage: the fuel that keeps its war machine alive. The peninsula hosts an estimated 60,000 troops, hundreds of armored vehicles and air defense systems that rely on a constant flow of diesel, kerosene, and aviation fuel. When those supplies stopped, so did everything else. As one Defense News analyst wrote, "A tank without diesel is a bunker. A warplane without jet fuel is a museum piece." Satellite reconnaissance from Maxar Technologies in mid-October confirmed the visible stagnation across Crimean bases: idle convoys clustered near Sevastopol, empty tankers in rail yards, and unmoving MiG-31 and Su-34 aircraft parked wingtip to wingtip. According to Reuters, Ukrainian strikes had destroyed or disabled at least 6 major storage facilities across the peninsula since July, eliminating over 40% of its total fuel reserve capacity. Even when Russia attempted emergency shipments via small ferries or barges, many were intercepted or turned back under threat from Ukraine's naval drones. Inside the ranks, frustration boiled. Leaked communications from Russian soldiers, verified by BBC monitoring, described units rationing fuel by the leader. "We can't move armor, can't rotate artillery," one message read. "We're sitting targets." Ukrainian Commander-in-Chief Oleksandr Syrsky later confirmed that Operation Deep Strike, as it was known in Kyiv, aimed precisely to achieve that outcome, immobilizing Russian formations without engaging them head-on. This doctrine, Western experts say, mirrors the US and NATO concept of logistical paralysis. By dismantling supply hubs rather than frontline units, Ukraine forced Russia into a static defense, costly, demoralizing, and unsustainable. The Guardian quoted a former Pentagon logistics officer: "Russia's army in Crimea isn't retreating because it can't. It's too heavy to move and too dry to fight," compounding the crisis. The Black Sea Fleet, already battered by drone and missile attacks, found its fuel depots empty. Naval patrols dwindled to a fraction of their usual activity. Al Jazeera reported that by late October, Russia had quietly relocated several warships from Sevastopol to Novorossiysk, an implicit admission that maintaining operations in Crimea had become impossible. Even air defense units struggled. Radar trucks and missile carriers required fuel to reposition after every Ukrainian strike. Without mobility, their survivability plummeted. Western intelligence officials told DW that Russia's total operational fuel availability in southern theaters had fallen by 35% since midsummer. The U.S. National Defense University analysis projected that if Ukraine maintains current strike frequency, Russian mechanized capacity in Crimea could drop to non-operational levels within 8 weeks. The effects were visible beyond the battlefield. Stalled supply convoys, backed up for kilometers on the M17 highway, a grim reminder of an army choking on its own logistical weakness. President Donald Trump's administration has quietly framed these developments as validation of its recalibrated aid policy: fewer blank checks, more intelligence sharing. In remarks leaked to the New York Times, a senior National Security Council official said Ukraine's precision strategy demonstrates that energy disruption, not troop escalation, can rewrite the map. NATO commanders echoed this sentiment, calling the campaign a masterclass in modern warfare economics. Still, the question remains: how long can Russia sustain a war when its army is running out of the very resource that powers its weapons? Inside Moscow, unease is growing. Officials in the defense ministry have begun reassigning fuel trucks from civilian sectors, deepening shortages at home. Even state TV pundits, once defiant, now speak of temporary logistical difficulties, code for paralysis. And yet the shockwaves of this crisis reach far beyond the battlefield. What happens when the empire that once dominated global energy markets can no longer fuel itself? The fire that consumed Feodosia's refinery didn't just darken Crimea, it burned through the very foundation of Russia's energy empire. Within weeks of the strike, the economic tremors reached Moscow. Gasoline production across the country dropped by nearly 1 million tons in September alone, according to Reuters and Bloomberg Economics, marking a 20% shortfall in domestic fuel consumption. For a state that once called itself the energy heart of Eurasia, this collapse was more than technical, it was existential. Facing a crisis, it could no longer disguise. The Kremlin moved to ban all gasoline exports indefinitely. DW reported that Russia, in a desperate reversal, began importing up to 300,000 tons of gasoline monthly from Belarus and lifted import duties on fuel from Asian partners, such as China and South Korea. The irony was striking. The same power that once wielded energy as a weapon was now begging for the oil to keep its own tanks running. "It's an empire that has lost its lifeblood," wrote The Guardian's Moscow correspondent. The economic data confirmed the narrative. The Russian State Development Bank (VEB) acknowledged a 0.6% GDP contraction over 2 consecutive quarters, the textbook definition of a technical recession. Meanwhile, Sberbank CEO German Gref warned that the country was entering a prolonged phase of stagnation. In an attempt to plug defense spending shortfalls, the Ministry of Finance raised VAT from 20% to 22%, effectively taxing ordinary Russians to keep the war engine sputtering. The result was growing unrest. Small protests erupted in Belgorod Tula, and even in parts of Crimea itself, where residents openly questioned Moscow's promises of stability. Western analysts draw chilling parallels. Al Jazeera recalled Kazakhstan's 2022 fuel price riots, which toppled a 3-decade regime. The same combustible mix, inflation, rationing, and disillusionment is now simmering in Russia. When an authoritarian state loses control of its supply chain, it loses control of its people, observed BBC's security editor. Even loyalist governors have quietly pleaded for federal relief, warning that energy scarcity is triggering food shortages and blackouts across southern regions. On the global stage, the shockwaves are strategic. Under President Trump's administration, the U.S. has emphasized an energy containment doctrine, leveraging intelligence, sanctions, and allied logistics to pressure Moscow economically rather than militarily. NATO officials told Defense News that Ukraine's campaign effectively accelerates this containment, creating a feedback loop. Each refinery destroyed further limits Russia's ability to fund its war, amplifying the impact of Western sanctions. "It's the 21st century version of siege warfare," said one senior NATO strategist. "You don't need to storm the fortress if you can drain its fuel." Inside the Kremlin, the tone has shifted from defiance to quiet anxiety. The once grand vision of Crimea as Russia's eternal bastion has become a cautionary tale. Intelligence sources quoted by the New York Times report growing tensions within Putin's inner circle over how to sustain military operations amid cascading supply failures. Even propaganda networks have toned down their rhetoric, focusing instead on promises of reconstruction, a word that echoes defeat more than victory. And yet, amid the smoke and silence, one question dominates Western briefings and Russian living rooms alike. Is this the beginning of the end for Russia's occupation of Crimea? As NATO analysts point out, Ukraine has achieved what seemed impossible 2 years ago, crippling a superpower's war front, not with nuclear firepower, but with precision, patience, and persistence. The flames in Feodosia may have faded, but their glow now illuminates the fragility of Russia's power. Crimea's blackout is not just a regional event. It's a symbol of how the empire that once exported fear now imports fuel. So, as winter approaches and Moscow scrambles to keep its lights on, one question burns brighter than the fires in Feodosia: how long can a nation built on oil survive when its tanks and its people are running on empty?